Chapter 25, Star-Crossed. Star-Crossed. Fritha watched her reflection as she sat at her dresser, the tweezers poised at her brow. A flash of silver, a sharp stab of pain that faded as quickly as it sparked, and her left eyebrow was one hair the tidier, the right still bearing the marks of her work, the skin pink and glowing beneath the smooth ember curve. Last night, she and Minsk had sat out until she had memorized the next 4 verses of the ode, before they had eventually returned to the warmth of the tavern, and Fritha had rejoined the others in cards, unenthusiastically at first, but she had been glad she had by the time Ari and Herr Dallas returned back a few hands later. Ari had been draped in his coat, something which Fritha thought spoke more of recent decisions than the evening's chill, and the girl had been thankful that when they had arrived she had been laughing about something with Nalia, looking very happy and naturally so. From there, Fritha had managed to muster just enough bravado to finish the current game, and by then it had finally been a reasonable hour to retire, the girl bowing out to escape to her room and the bed she had truly wished she had not left that morning. Another flick of her wrist and pain flared again, the snap of her tweezers and faint rustle of paper the only thing to break the stillness of the room as Nalia read on the bed behind her. Fritha had slept late that morning, in that she was tired and it seemed no one was willing to disturb her, and she did not wake until the sun had risen enough to send shafts of heavy light across her bed, gilding the room about her. She had lain there dozing for a few moments more, trying to muster the energy to rouse herself and face the day, when a sharp knocking dragged her from her bed and she had opened the door to reveal, not Jahara as she had suspected, but Nalia, the girl greeting her with a tray of breakfast. And so she had climbed back into bed, Nalia perched at the foot with the tray between them, Fritha picking at the food and eating more to make the girl feel better than from any real hunger as they chatted idly of their plans for the day. The girl was still there now, sat on the bed behind her, though Fritha was up and dressed, seated before the dresser and slowly plucking her eyebrows as she tried to prepare herself for the day to come. "Fritha!" came Nalia impatiently, the girl's voice breaking through her thoughts. "Fritha, you haven't been listening to a word I've said, have you?" "I'm sorry, I was concentrating," Fritha sighed, wincing as she plucked out another hair. "I was just saying, I hope Jahara remembers to get more oil. You were listening when I told you Jahara went with Minsk to buy supplies this morning?" asked Nalia, a hint of reproach creeping into her voice. She hadn't been. Fritha felt her cheeks burn, wrenching out another hair and nipping the skin beneath in her irritation. "You know I was." She could feel the girl's eyes on her back, and put all her focus into catching the next hair as Nalia continued, her voice suddenly softer. "Fritha, if you would like to talk about yesterday." "No thank you," she answered promptly, and she heard Nalia sigh. To be honest, she would not have minded sharing her fears with the girl, her dread at going downstairs and being confronted with Ari and Herr Dallas and their mutual adoration, or even worse to have them spring apart as she entered, eyes full of pity, and Fritha was not sure what she was going to do. Well, she knew what she'd do, as an act like everything was fine. But everything did not feel fine at all, and Fritha was more than a little worried she might not be able to pretend it was. But in the end, no amount of talk would change the fact that in a moment she would have to go down there and watch the pair together, just as they were going to be from this day hence, and that was that. If only she could effect some sort of distraction, just to take the edge off this initial meeting. She let her eyes flick back to her reflection, a stern frown creasing her brow. "Now just focus, you can do this." "Ah, Nalia, you're in here," came a familiar voice behind her, and Fritha turned to see Jahara, the door swinging shut behind her as she stepped into the room. "And Fritha's awake and dressed as well, LC, a miracle in itself." She finished with a dry smile which Fritha did not share, the girl turning wordlessly back to her reflection. "Are you still sulking?" the druid continued in an offhand manner, and Fritha felt a surge of irritation.
Yes, I am, and I'll sulk a good while longer too, if you please,
she snapped laughingly, aware of how childish she sounded even as she spoke. Fritha shook her head with a rueful sigh.
I'm being a pain, aren't I?
No, came Nalia soothingly, just as the druid gave a firm yes, and the pair glowered at each other. Fritha drew a deep breath, trying to ignore the tightness of her stomach and hitching a smile into place.
Right, I'm done moping for the day. Is everyone downstairs, Jahara?
The druid went to answer when a knock at the door cut her off, the women opening it to reveal a gnomon, his brow furrowed with a worried frown.
Ladies, I come to tell you Avis has just arrived downstairs. She brings most troubling news.
A gnomon moved back down the staircase to the tavern, his armor rattling with every step, the three women following him, Fritha finally ready to leave as well it seemed. A gnomon frowned slightly as he recalled the strange light that had flashed in her eyes when he told her Avis had just arrived at their table with grim news, and perhaps it was just his imagination. But for a moment Fritha had looked almost elated, the girl standing quickly and asking Nalia to pack her remaining few possessions as she shrugged on her chainmail and belted on her sword, suddenly all eagerness. But a gnomon could hardly complain at this unexpected change, especially since he had not relished the idea of returning to the common room without her. Avis had burst into the tavern where they had been awaiting Fritha, breathless and flushed and barely sparing the others a glance in her haste, the girl saying she had run all the way from the order in her search for him, quickly explaining the latest developments regarding the runaways and tearfully begging him to help. A gnomon had never been comfortable watching other people cry, especially young women, and he was quite relieved to have been able to gently explain that he would have to consult their leader before anything could be decided. The girl's look of teary disbelief that it was not he holding such a role rather flattering. And so he had gone to fetch Fritha, Avis still in tears when he had left, Ari, Herdalis and Minsk all trying to console the girl, though with little success.
There now, why don't you sit down? Come now, my chick, eyes such as yours were not meant for tears. Worry not, little one. Minsk and Boo will smite your enemies.
A gnomon looked over to the table as he stepped down into the tavern. Avis now sat opposite Minsk and the bard, whey-faced and red-eyed, though it seemed she had finally composed herself, Ari hovering at her arm as the girl drank a cup of tea with shaking hands.
Here, Avis,
a gnomon began gently, gesturing politely to the girl next to him as Fritha gave the maid an encouraging smile.
This is Fritha, please explain to her as you did to me.
Avis swallowed and nodded, sniffing as she handed Fritha a worn square of parchment.
Here, m'lady, she tremored, this was delivered to my master's house sometime last night, I'm not sure when, only I found it early this morning when I went to scrub the front step and Master Cornwell bade me bring it to Squire Anoman.
Fritha unfolded it, eyes flying over the parchment.
A ransom note,
she said finally for the benefit of the table, before passing it to Jahara,
addressed to the Cornwells, detailing the sum and where it should be left if they wish for their daughter, Helenya's safe return.
I see, came the druid after a moment, refolding the parchment back up and returning it to Fritha.
And how did the family react to this news? Master Cornwell is very angry and my mistress has not stopped crying since we found it. They believe this confirms their worst fears about the sort of man Lursand is, but I can't believe he managed to fool Helenya so, there must be another answer.
Before a gnomon would have agreed with the parents without a moment's pause, but his meeting with Cestus had shown him that a different sort of honor could exist within such men, and he could believe Avis's trust was not entirely misplaced.
Oh, please,
the girl continued when no one made any reply to this, her eyes darting back to him imploringly, and a gnomon swallowed his discomfort.
there must be something you can do.
Fritha gave her a sympathetic look, her voice soft.
Hush now, calm yourself. If they are sending out ransom notes, then it is hardly likely Helenya has come to any harm as yet.
Indeed, agreed Jahara, though more to the table that the girl herself.
It could merely be a ruse on the part of the children, to trick the money to start a new life from her parents.
Avis frowned but did stop crying at least, sniffing slightly as she began to dab her eyes on her apron.
I suppose, but it does not sound like Helenya to me, but then,
she admitted miserably,
I never could have imagined her to run away either. There now,
Ari soothed, giving the girl a reassuring smile.
Maybe she does not even know the message has been sent. My pipit,
Herr Dallas agreed with a fond glance to the elf.
We have it on the word of his friend that the group they are with were running short of supplies. Perhaps they are trying to trick gold from your nest without her or Lursan's knowledge.
The girl sniffed again, but Anoman was pleased to see her brighten slightly.
I hope you are right.
Ari smiled and nodded, giving her shoulder a pat as Jahara shouldered her bag pointedly.
Well, it's late in the morning as it is, and we must be setting off if we are to confirm anything either way.
Yes, agreed Fritha, glancing back to the maid to continue.
Tell your master we are heading for where we last know this group were camped and not to do anything with regards to the ransom until he hears otherwise from us. We've a few days yet, that should be enough.
The girl sniffed, nodding dolefully, and Fritha turned to the group about her.
Is everyone ready to leave?
Murmurs of assent and Fritha nodded, shouldering her pack as well.
Then off we go.
The trees rustled in the faint breeze, the light that dappled the forest floor changing as the leaves moved, making the ground shimmer as though water. Jahara smiled, enjoying the feel of life all about her. The beauty of the trees, the drone of the insects, the damp rich smell of the earth underfoot all made her feel a small but important part of something larger, that whatever happened to her, this greater complex life of the natural world would go on. They had been heading south for a good few hours now, following Sestuza's crude but surprisingly accurate map of the forest, the last camp apparently situated somewhere in the fork between two streams which fed into the river that ultimately split Athkatla, the group already across the first and heading westwards downstream towards the point of convergence. Jahara smiled gently to herself, casting her eyes up to the leaves above her, a beautiful mix of greens and yellows as the year neared to its close. Autumn had been Khalid's favorite season. He had always claimed it was merely because he liked the colors, but sometimes she would catch him just stood beneath the trees, his eyes almost closed, and she considered it was perhaps something deeper. Khalid had always had an affinity with nature, not like her own, but she thought he perhaps had appreciated it in ways that she could not. Jahara sighed, her heart suddenly heavy. She had dreamt of him last night. Not that she had remembered any details really, but she had woken with the warm comforting sense that he was near, only for it to slowly dawn on her that such a thing was impossible, and the weight of his death, which she had carried since the dungeon, sank once more upon her spirit, all the worse for this brief respite. Jahara dropped her eyes back to the path before her, Minsk leading the way with Anoman, while just behind them were Ari and Herr Dallas. The pair were walking side by side and very close, neither requiring much of an excuse to touch the other, much to Nalia's displeasure, the girl walking next to her and huffing audibly each time they dared. Jahara smiled slightly at Nalia's disapproval, sure it had more to do with worry for her friend than any offense on her part. The druid glancing behind her to where Fritha was bringing up the rear alone, absently singing a love song under her breath, requited, but of melancholy bearing all the same. Fritha's romantic affray had brought back memories of her own courting, of the soft look Khalid would give her across the campfire on an evening, and the thousand small ways he had found to show his regard however adverse their situation. Jahara smiled as she recalled their first meeting. It was at Zazaspur in Tethur. Both of them sent along with others to investigate the emergence of a smuggling group that was moving certain restricted drugs up from Kalimshan and through the city onto more wealthy areas in the Sword Coast. Those Harpers involved had all gathered in the backroom of a local tavern that was owned by a man sympathetic to their cause. Khalid had seemed so shy and nervous, she could hardly believe he was a member. But then over the course of that mission and many others, she had grown to know him better and saw how such quietness hid a strong will, the man committed to the Harpers and their ideals with an intense resolve. They had been so different, but so suited too, though she had been reluctant to admit it at first. Jahara smiled, remembering her initial opposition to his interest in her. She had always maintained that as a Harper and Druid she had had no time in her life for a relationship of any sort. But when that quietly determined gaze fell upon her, she knew nothing would deter him and had eventually acquiesced with good grace. But 1 short year later, they were married and had remained so for many happy years. Jahara shook her head, such reminiscences as pleasant as they were painful, and she had not the time now to truly appreciate either, the woman turning her attention back to the pair before her. It seemed the bard had not left the city before now, and his appreciation of the surroundings was quite pleasant to see, Ari gently telling him the names of the trees and plants they passed and getting them right for the most part. Truth be told, Jahara was pleased things had worked out as they had. Fritha would have likely found it difficult to manage the group and a relationship, and the Druid did not think Herr Dallas would have done anything to aid her in the task. Fritha had always been prone to oddness, with a strong imagination and a tendency to let it run away with her. Something which probably had much to do with being brought up in a library full of old men with only one child of her own age for company, and the girl needed someone who would ground, not encourage her. Though it was likely Fritha was not feeling as pleased as she was with the way things had turned out, Jahara considered practically. Poor fool. The first time was always the worst, and she had not meant to be so dismissive of Fritha's feelings that morning. But the memories of Khalid had been still bright within her, and it had been difficult to bear the girl's melancholy whilst ignoring her own. At least Fritha had managed to avoid trouble from other quarters, though the girl remained unaware of her good fortune. Jahara had finally managed to find the time to visit the Harpers' Hall a couple of days ago, on the evening Fritha went to view the auditions, the girl's absence adequately covering her own delay in returning from their investigations. The senior Harper there, Galvary, was young considering his position but seemed wise with it, something she had not expected when she had entered the already rather ostentatious building on the quays and found the interior would not have looked out of place in a pasha's court, all white marble and colored silks. But apart from this unnecessary opulence, she noticed no other thirst to prove himself, Galvary treating her with the respect due any Harper and confirming that she travelled with the god's child, Fritha, to which the Druid reluctantly admitted. The man was seemingly unconcerned about her heritage though, stating Jahara had travelled with her long enough now, and if she could vouch for the girl then he was sure everything would be fine. Jahara could not pretend she did not find this result a relief. She had no family and, without Khalid, the Harpers were all she had left of her life outside Fritha's company. She would not have liked to have seen the two at odds. Galvary had concluded the meeting by asking her to report back to the hall in another 10 days or so, something to which she had readily agreed.
And perhaps you could bring the girl with you, just to put our superiors' minds at rest, of course,
he had inquired slowly, eyes carefully watching her reaction. But Jahara had wondered whether it was not just to sate his own curiosity, making some offhand excuse for the girl, and he had not pressed the issue, saying he understood if it was not possible, and in the end they parted amicably enough. A particularly loud sigh broke through her thoughts and Jahara sent a glance to the girl next to her, Nalia glowering fiercely at the pair before them as Ari faltered slightly on some root or the like, Herr Dallas stepping in so dramatically to steady her that, for a moment, Jahara thought he was going to sweep the elf up into his arms and carry her.
Really, I know they are all young love first discovered,
Nalia snapped, her tone unusually scathing,
but they could at least try to be discreet.
Jahara actually thought they looked quite nice together, but she could see where the girl was coming from. They were hardly being subtle, and a glance behind confirmed that they had not been the only ones to notice the pair, Fritha sending her a half-smile and a shrug as though to say she had not expected anything less. Next to her, Nalia sighed deeply.
I wish she would talk to me.
Jahara glanced back to her with mild surprise, she had though the two had grown quite close during this convoluted affair.
She won't.
The girl shook her head.
No, I have tried, but she just keeps changing the subject.
Ah, Fritha. This unwillingness to let others help could be a destructive trait, something Jahara knew firsthand. She had been bad for it herself in her youth and perhaps sometimes now as well, if she was being honest.
Well, bear with her, she finds it hard to talk to others sometimes. I imagine she expects leaders to be made of sterner stuff. Imoen really was the only one she would confide in before, though.
Jahara considered aloud.
Things were different then, perhaps she wouldn't have even talked to her now, though I suspect the girl herself would have had quite a bit to say about that.
Nalia sighed again, glancing back to Fritha with a concerned look.
I hate to see her like this. Can't you try?
Jahara glanced back as well, Fritha following them as she had been and still singing very quietly under her breath, either that or she was talking to herself. Jahara sighed, recalling her previous terseness.
No, I think I've said enough for one day.
They reached the bandits' campsite late that afternoon, though there was no sign of anyone, and Jahara agreed with Minsk. By the look of the fire pit and the surrounding tracks they were probably following a group of 12 or more and no one had been there for several days, further investigations revealing 2 sets of tracks leading from the site. The main body of people apparently continued their journey southeastwards while a smaller group of probably no more than 3 headed northwest, back to the city.
So which path do we follow?
Asked Nalia, looking from one to the other.
The majority went south,
offered a Nomen.
Yes,
agreed Fritha, gesturing to the tracks north.
But let's follow this trail for a while. I want to know if they were heading to the city or not, and we can always turn back if it leads to nothing.
It was decided and they continued their journey, the group traveling another half an hour, crossing the northern stream again, and they had just recovered the trail when Jahara noticed something. A smell, heavy and sour, faint at first but growing stronger with every step, and she was not surprised when Minsk finally called them to a halt in a clearing of beech trees, the druid pushing to the head of the group to confirm her suspicions. A few paces into the undergrowth, a dark-haired man was sprawled face down, dead, and by the smell, he had been so for some time. Jahara moved forward to crouch down next to him, the group around her taking a step back as she rolled the body over to reveal a young man, his pale face bloated and discolored, the ground where he had lain a writhing mass of insects and larvae.
So, is this Lursand?
She asked with a glance to those above her. A Nomen nodded once, looking troubled.
It certainly fits the description we were given.
Jahara dropped her eyes back to the body, seemingly unmarked barring the even slash across his neck, the grey-white skin curling back from the wound as though it wished to speak. The front of his tunic was stained with blood, the ground beneath him still bearing traces as well, and Jahara suspected he had been killed in the clearing and dumped there to bleed out. She glanced again to those about her.
No defensive wounds and his throat was cut.
Frithha nodded slowly, eyes traveling over the body.
That suggests a certain intimacy. He likely knew his attacker, then, trusted them.
The girl glanced to her face for confirmation and Jahara nodded.
It would seem so,
she agreed, though what this meant she could only guess. Frithha sighed, turning to the man next to her.
Well, we can't leave him like this. Minsk, do you have the spade?
The ranger nodded, taking it from where it was strapped to the back of his pack and beginning to dig at the foot of a nearby tree, the others disbanding behind him at Frithha's instruction and moving back towards the stream to prepare camp for the night. The fire was lit and the water for dinner already hung over it heating when Minsk finally finished, Jahara helping him to move the body and cover it over while Frithha set to scratching a rough L on the stone in her lap. The girl had wanted to carve something on the tree at his head, but Jahara would hear nothing of it, so Frithha settled on a large flat rock which she had found during her search for firewood and lugged back to use as a marker. Once buried, all there was to do was to set the stone in place, everyone gathering about the grave while Jahara held a hand over it and closed her eyes in prayer.
From nature, we came. To nature, we return. Peace be with you.
A murmur of oaths and agreement followed, though no one moved to go, all unwilling to leave so soon, it seemed, or at least to be the first to do so.
Someone should say something else, pray for his soul's repose,
said Nalya eventually, glancing about them, her eyes coming to rest upon the squire.
Well, I hardly think he worshipped Helm,
said a Noman tersely, looking unusually uncomfortable. Frithha shrugged.
Mask's as good a bet as any and at least he's used to listening to my whinging.
The girl dropped to her knees, touched her mouth, forehead and chest in quick succession to bless herself, before holding both hands out cupped before her and intoned a prayer, quick and droning of one who had learned it by rote, before asking peace for Lursand's soul and promising great offerings for the task.
Only,
the girl admitted, her eyes still closed in prayer,
I can't make the offering now, you understand. But I'll definitely bring something to your shrine once I'm back in the city and you can trust me for it, because I always repay my debts and... Frithha,
Jahara prompted.
Glory be thy name,
the girl finished quickly, blessing herself again as she rose, Anomen, Ari and Jahara following suit, the group turning as one to return to camp. Darkness had fallen quickly, the nights drawing in as summer faded to autumn, the fire lighting the faces of the group sat around it and making the surrounding forest all the darker, stars just visible between the black silhouette of branches above. Frithha pulled her cloak about her more tightly, glad for the warm cup in her hands, letting the voices of the others drift over her as they discussed the runaways and this most recent and troubling development.
So it looks more certain than ever that Helenya is being held against her will,
sighed Jahara, Anoman nodding gravely.
We can only hope that, since they wish to gain the ransom for her return, she remains unharmed.
Frithha sighed, dropping her gaze to her cup, the firelight making the tea within shimmer like quicksilver. Poor Lursand. Poor Helenya too. And Frithha considered she had even more sympathy for the girl than he, because once you were dead the hard part was pretty much over with, it was those you left who had to bear the burden of it. Frithha let her eyes drift up to the couple sat opposite her, two others who were paying no attention to the talk around them, the light from the fire giving them both a golden hue, Herr Dallas's scars bright on his face and Frithha wondered absently what they would feel like to touch. He was smiling, his fingers playing with the hem of Aries' sleeve as he leaned in to whisper something at her ear, and Fritha felt a burning stab of jealousy, taking a long draught of tea as though to quench it. But however green-eyed and miserable she was feeling, she could not put herself in the elf's place, sat there with the bard so tenderly, it would have all been too soon for her. Fritha sighed slightly to herself. Not that she had not imagined such scenarios before, her and he alone together, perhaps back in the gloomy flies of her theatre or a dozen other places, some just existing only in her mind. But that was all they were, just idle dreams to be indulged in as she lay in her bed at night during that hazy twilight between wake and sleep. And there they would stay, because Herr Dallas was with Ari, and that was the end of it.
Well, Fritha,
broke a voice through her thoughts, and she started to find the group staring at her.
Sorry,
she mumbled, pulling her attention away from the pair opposite, Nalia sending them a scowl, and Fritha smiled even as she felt embarrassed. The girl's continuing anger with the couple may have been a touch unreasonable, but it was a comfort to know that someone had her welfare at heart.
We were talking of our plans,
repeated Jahara, and looking most displeased. It was necessary for her to do so.
Of what our approach should be once we actually locate these bandits.
Fritha shrugged slightly, finishing her tea with a sigh.
I suppose we'll just have to play it as it comes. Today's discovery says nothing more than Lursand made an enemy of someone. Helen Ya may not know he's dead, neither may his group for that matter. We've no proof it was they who killed him, the poor sod.
What did you call him? Came Herr Dallas suddenly, head jerking towards her.
Sorry, I did not mean to offend your sensibilities, Sparrow. You did nothing of the sort,
he snapped, his voice easing again as he continued.
But that word, I did not know you knew the sigil cant. I don't. It's old Heartlands slang. And sigil cant too, it seems,
he concluded with a smile, Ari looking a touch displeased as he leaned forward eagerly.
Can you imagine, Fritha, perhaps our homes shared some link in the past. You do not appear to be so amazed,
he added sharply in face of her impassive look. Fritha shrugged, the epitome of indifference.
Should I be? Language comes from people, and people are prolific.
Unfortunately, her mind added snidely, and she suppressed a grin with difficulty as she continued.
Words travel as seeds within birds. A Heartlando went to Sigil. A Cager came to the Heartlands. Either way the word came too. Well, offer up some more, my raven,
he said with an encouraging smile.
I am interested to see how far this goes, and for all your apathy, I'll warrant you are too.
Fritha shook her head. She was interested, but their discussions were somehow not as enjoyable as they used to be.
Perhaps another day, I am tired of games for the moment. Well, the night is deepening, should we think about bedding down?
Murmurs of agreement, and Jahara nodded.
Indeed, there will be 4 2-hour watches or thereabout. I shall take one. Are there any volunteers for the others?
Ari straightened the blanket over her knees. The elf sat on her bedding and watching the others laying out their own around the fire. She had offered to take the night's first watch, Fritha and Minsk both volunteering for the more awkward middle two, and Jahara liked to rise early anyway, if only to pray, so she decided to take the last. Ari smiled as her gaze fell upon the man next to her in the circle. Herr Dallas sat upon the bedding they had bought for him that morning, still unfolding his blanket. He had offered to take her watch with her, the dark look to his eyes as he had suggested it making her heart quicken. But in the end she had refused him. So much had happened in the last few days, and she was looking forward to some time alone to think things through. Last night had been wonderful and terrible in the extremes, and she recalled clearly the empty feeling that had blossomed in her stomach as she had watched Fritha walking up to the table, Haerdalis's coat draped about her. However many times her mind had repeated over and over that it was probably just because she had been cold and that it all meant nothing, it still did nothing to close the sudden hole that had opened in her heart, and Ari had truly believed her dreams were crushed as she fled for the bar, all her thoughts on how she could return to her room before she burst into tears. But then he had followed her and calmed her, helping her get the tea and making her laugh, all the time her heart hovering between hope and despair. But Haerdalis had stayed with her when Fritha threw his coat at him moments later, and when he finally invited her to walk out later that evening, she knew he was hers and she could barely speak for her joy, though, Ari considered with a fond smile, Haerdalis's talk more than filled the silence. And it was ever so that morning, the man's attentions never far from her, always asking questions or describing to her the plains, and she was so utterly and unexpectedly happy, she could hardly believe it was real.
Ah!
Nalia shrieked suddenly, making more than one person start as she began shaking her blanket wildly, Fritha sending the girl a concerned glance.
What is it? There was an earwig on my blanket. I think it's gone now though.
She added, with a wary glance to the bedroll at her feet.
Well, it won't hurt you, girl,
sighed Jaehaera tersely, and Nalia pulled a face at her, though Ari noticed that she had waited until the druid's back was turned before she did so. Fritha smiled, sinking onto her own bedding with an absent sigh.
I remember when we were younger, Imoen telling me they were called earwigs because when you were asleep they would crawl into your ear and make a little nest there and lay their eggs. And you would wake up the next day none the wiser and you would be walking about normally and suddenly baby earwigs would be dropping from your ear and crawling all over your face and such. I was beside myself. I remember I slept with strips of linen stuffed in each ear for months afterwards.
Fritha sighed gently, lying down and pulling the covers over her.
I miss her.
Ari turned away from her, feeling suddenly guilty. It was a cruel world that could only give happiness at the expense of others, and she wondered if Fritha was feeling as awful as Ari knew she would have. The elf sighed. Happy as she was, it was difficult to ignore others had been hurt in this. It was clear that Nalia was still very willing to hold a grudge, but Fritha had never really acted like a rival even when they were at odds, and Ari wondered whether if things would ever really be the same between the three of them again.
There is a dampness to the breeze, perhaps it will rain later,
considered Jaehaera aloud as she settled under her own blanket, and Nalia looked miserable.
It won't rain tonight, look at the moon,
said Fritha, pointing up from where she lay, and Ari followed her hand to a thin white crescent, the lower part illuminated, like the smile on an invisible face.
Beth used to say that when it lies like that, it will catch all the rain like a cup.
Ari often found that such folk tales had a good deal of truth behind them, even if the reasoning was far from sound, but the druid looked unconvinced.
I've never heard such nonsense. I've never seen it disproved.
Fritha countered hotly, and Jaehaera gave an exasperated sigh.
Yes, Fritha, but when it rains it is usual for clouds to obscure the sky.
A pause, and then quiet giggling rippled over the camp, and Ari could see the girl's blankets trembling, the laughter warm in her ears.
Fair point. Well, good night everyone.
Fritha sighed finally, her smile audible, and Ari watched as the girl turned over, her back to the fire as she settled down to sleep. Ari smiled slightly as she stared up at the thin sliver of moon, filled with a sudden resolve. She would be reconciled with the girl, with her and Nalia both. End of chapter.